Hello, hello.
I'm Savannah.
And I'm Elysia.
And this is Burden of Proof. Thanks for listening to our sexy music.
Sexy.
Sexy.
Schmexy.
Somebody commented that our music is too sexy for a true crime podcast, and I laugh at it every time I hear our music now. I think our music is the right amount of sexy.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah.
It works.
I love it.
We love it.
I do.
Welcome, everybody.
Hello.
Hello, hello. We do have a new patron.
Yes, we do. Hi, Michelle.
Thanks, Michelle,
Woohoo.
for joining us on Patreon.
Love to see it.
Do we have any other business?
I don't think we do.
I don't think we do. Well, hope all of you enjoyed Bonnie Craig last week.
Woohoo.
And yeah, I don't know. It's been a relatively
Normal month,
normal week around here.
Oh, I know
So-
what it is. This episode comes out the day before our live stream. So if you're on Patreon, our live stream is the 24th. It's tomorrow. This comes out if you're listening to this on drop day, the 23rd of May. The 24th of May is our live stream for our Patreon members, our patrons. And if you don't get to watch it live, you can always watch it after the fact on Patreon.
Yes.
Go Wildcats. So today we're talking about a case that's actually a little bit more popular than the cases we normally talk about. We normally are we have some more indie cases, but we've got this one. This one's a little bit more popular. Our friends at Gore Report have covered it.
Okay.
Which I didn't know when I started researching. And then I was like, oh, I'll just listen to a podcast on because I had a long drive. I went to go pick up a Dyson off of Facebook Marketplace. So I had a long drive. I was like, I'll listen to this so that's I can get a good taste of it. Typed it into Spotify. Gore Report popped up. And so did our friends at Beers with Queers, which I love that podcast so much. If you guys haven't listened to Beers with Queers, highly recommend.
Yes.
So good. They covered it. Morbid has covered it. So I hope you guys haven't heard. But if you have, I'm excited to talk about it and put my own little spin on it today with the legal proceedings.
Yeah.
Woohoo. But this case, I thought I knew what I was getting into. And then I decided that I was going to read a book written about the case. Whoa. Way more that I did not know. So
Interesting.
I hope you're ready for some weird stuff.
I'm ready. Bring it.
All right. Also, when you're done listening, there's a lot of really good visuals in this case. There's going to be some cool pictures on our Instagram and our Facebook pages. I really recommend you go look at them because you'll know. You'll hear what I'm saying and you're going to be like, yeah, I need to see that picture.
Okay.
Cool. The town hall of Trion, Georgia still loomed over the town as the centerpiece, surrounded by a beautiful landscape. The area is full of Christian values and long-term residents. Their clerk of court has worked in the same spot her entire career, and the judge was the same. The people of the town rested easy, knowing that their cartoon character-style sheriff was keeping their town safe at night.
I was going to say this is all sounding very cartoonish.
Oh, it is a movie. This is a movie.
Wow.
This is I couldn't have written this. It's insane. Now,
Scooby-Doo involved. I don't know.
Maybe.
That's the next thing I thought of.
It's crazy.
Okay.
So, while being a small town, they were home to some eclectics, but they were their eclectics, and they were fine with them.
Mm-hmm.
They were the home of a strange street preacher and a nudist, and while unconventional, they were fine with them being there. The street preacher is actually now a well-known national folk artist. His name is Howard Finster, and he sort of added his own delusioned, strange version of Christianity into all of his artwork. He actually did album covers for the Talking Heads. And is it REM or REM in the 80s? I'm sorry.
Oh, that hurts my heart.
I know.
It's REM.
Okay. I knew that, but then I started second guessing it and I was like, I'm gonna get eaten alive about it because I knew it was gonna happen. But he did album covers for both the Talking Heads and REM in the 80s.
Nice.
And he was very pleased with this because he put Bible verses into this artwork and he says this did more than 40 years of preaching ever did. It went out into the universe. So he was an oddball for sure.
And REM, some of their music has some very underlying Christian stuff.
Yeah.
As in challenging, I would say.
The people of the town knew that some of the stuff he liked wasn't truly Christianity. So like they tolerated him, but they had some issues with it, you know?
Yeah.
But they were fine because it was his. Like he belonged there.
Yeah.
One thing about me, and I think I may have mentioned this before, but when I travel, I really feel like I tune into the energy of a city. And I've never been to Trion, but the way that this is described so much throughout my research, like I just feel like I was there. And it just has this really peaceful, eerie quality that's just like slightly creepy, but it knows exactly who it is. Like this town is exactly what it thinks it is. And there's something really comforting about that. Some people are probably like, what is this crazy girl talking about? It's creepy. It is creepy, but you'll see why.
Yeah.
And you look at pictures of the town and it's just like, yeah, this is a small town, but there's something there. It's bizarre.
What's there?
So I dug into the feeling a little bit more.
Yeah.
Because I knew what I was looking at. Like I knew what the crime was when I started researching about the town.
Okay.
And reading this book about the town. But what I didn't know is that there were actually 4 horrific crimes that have taken place in or around this town.
Wow.
Like shocking crimes.
Creepy.
Maybe we will talk about the others. I might do a little series on Trion, Georgia. But for now, we're talking about the murders at Corpsewood Manor.
Okay.
We open our story with Dr. Charles Scudder. Charles comes from a well-off family, growing up to be a professor of pharmacology. He had a PhD, not a medical doctor. And he furthered his career by becoming the assistant director for the Institute for the Study of Mind, Drugs, and Behavior.
Okay.
This led him to government work, performing experiments involving government-produced LSD and its effects. Literally like MK Ultra style.
Oh boy.
This is the centerpiece of our story today.
Oh boy. Okay.
Side note, like I mentioned, my main source is a book called The Corpsewood Manor Murders in North Georgia. And the author makes the best comparison, and I knew instantly, I was like, this is the book for me. Because she says, he kind of looks like Carlisle Cullen from Twilight. And I was like, yes, I looked at this and I was like, he looks familiar. His younger years, he looked like Carlisle Cullen. So I was like, this is perfect for me. Charles was an oddball. He was known to dye his hair purple while he was a professor and he was teaching. And you know what? I could go on and on about the weird things about him, but I'm just going to let it come out organically for you, as it did for me.
Okay. What year was this?
So
like what time period?
The main part of the case is in the early 80s. So it's like 60s, 70s, 80s.
Right.
Yeah.
So, wow.
Purple hair.
Purple hair back then was a big deal.
Yep. So Charles married once in his early 20s, and then a second time to an activist, in which he had 4 children. Unfortunately, one of them passed away. We're not really sure why, but his 3 living children were grown into men a long time ago. And for a while, it was just Charles and his housekeeper, Joey Odom. Odom comes from a starkly different background. Less than a 5th grade education, he comes from a poverty-stricken family, but the pair formed an unlikely bond. Joey and Charles were sort of inseparable. Charles employed him for years. He was always talking about how amazing Joey was in the kitchen. And somewhere along the way, the two became more than just friends. We aren't really positive about the true nature of their relationship, but they were certainly regularly intimate and pretty much domestic partners, even if there was very little romantic attraction there. Their friends were like, yes, they like regularly had sex, but they kept separate bedrooms. They both talked to other people and they just lived life together. So for a long time, Joey was his housekeeper and his assistant and all this other stuff. And when they lived in Chicago. So when he's teaching and all this stuff, he's living in downtown Chicago.
Okay.
Working at Loyola University. Some people think it was more romantic than they make it seem, especially because Charles eventually disinherits his 3 children entirely and leaves his entire estate to Joey Odom.
Oh, wow.
Joey is significantly younger than him, but they were friends for a really long time.
Okay.
So I'm going to call them a couple because it's just they are 2 people.
Yeah.
And their relationship is up for debate. Either way, they were both gay and they were having sex regularly. So that's really what matters and what you need to know.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned, they were living in a mansion in Chicago, sort of a rundown mansion, if I'm being honest. And Charles was making pretty good money, but after a while, he decides that he's quite done with the hustle and bustle of their everyday life. He wanted to settle down, and he was tired of watching Chicago change around him, tired of paying bills to the government. tired of paying for his water and electric, and not to mention he was like still closeted in Chicago and his religious beliefs were not out in the open. He was still weird. He had a pet monkey and purple hair. Don't get me wrong. But he's charming enough to pull it off and nobody thinks anything about it. And he was also like a fairly attractive guy. So everyone was just like, oh yeah, that's just Charles. He's just weird.
He's just eccentric.
Yes. But he and Joey were really invested in getting off the grid, away from the rat race of the city, into a place where they could live their lifestyle openly. Some people think that Charles kind of pushed Joey into this. That's not the case. Joey was equally wanting to do this. He liked to cook the old-fashioned way. Like, he didn't like to use an electric stove. He liked to cook on a wood stove, and he liked cast iron and like old. That's the way he wanted to live. And
Okay.
Charles agreed.
All right.
So when Charles's mother passes away, he gets a small inheritance. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to kind of push him over the edge into deciding that he was ready to be done. He and Joey began looking for a plot of land to build their dream home and settle down together. They find a 40-acre plot of land in the mountains in Georgia, near our small town of Trion. To celebrate his 50th birthday, he quits his job, and on his way out, he steals a few vials totaling 12,000 doses of LSD and 2 human skulls, just for the road. Government-made LSD. This is like pure LSD.
Okay. I'm not sure what to say about that.
You're not going to be sure what to say most of the time.
I'm
gets
starting
weirder.
to gather that.
It just gets weirder. Because, like, in theory, it makes sense. Yeah, you just want to, like, go move out to the country and slow down and
have enough LSD for the rest of your life.
But he doesn't do LSD.
Then, is he going to sell it?
Nope. We don't really know.
Is he going to give it to his pet monkey?
No, he doesn't take the monkey with him. I think the monkey... I don't know what happened to the monkey. He doesn't kill the monkey, I promise. Monkey's just
Oh,
gone.
no, but...
Bye, Marcel.
Marcel.
Oh, we away. That's a Friends reference. So they purchase the plot of land and they begin building dreams.
Drams. Drams.
Sorry. It's okay. They begin making plans for their dream home. Now, Elysia, when you close your eyes and you picture 40 acres of beautiful land in northern Georgia, and you're going to build your dream home, what does your dream home look like in northern Georgia?
Well, first of all, it wouldn't be in northern Georgia.
Okay.
But if that's where it has to be, I mean, I'm real keen on like craftsman style houses.
Okay. Beautiful. Beautiful answer.
Yeah.
Gorgeous idea. Do you think
I'm guessing this is not what happens?
It's not, and I'm going to surprise you. The two begin building, by hand, a brick mini castle.
Huh. That seems about right.
Yep.
Is that what he needed the skulls for?
Oh, the
like,
skulls
I don't know.
are just
Skulls
for
just
decoration.
seem to go with castle, you know?
They do, and also so does... okay, we'll get there.
And so does LSD, I guess.
No.
Okay.
So they choose to follow ancient building practices, and over a year, they build this insane home. There are no 90-degree angles in the main house at all. It is all circular and rounded edges. There's a drawbridge and a moat. I don't know if the moat had water in it. But there was, like, land between the entrance and the...
It can be a dry moat.
I don't even think it was, like, dug out. It was, like, intended to be a moat, but they hadn't done it yet.
Okay.
They constructed a stained glass window, and Charles installs a pink gargoyle at the front of their home to welcome their guests. Which, he had the pink gargoyle at his old house. So this isn't, like, a new thing.
Yeah.
And he also had all of this, like, Renaissance-era furniture from his original home that he then brought into this this is the manor.
Well, then that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. And he has
rather than decorate, to the home, you're
build
building the home around your decor.
For sure. Especially when he goes on to just furnish it with, like, thousands of dollars of, like, gothic art and satanic art and demonic art and, like, weird satanic statues and yeah. Not to mention, like, his own art, because he is an artist that we'll learn eventually towards the end of the episode. We'll talk about some of his art, which is fitting with the rest of it. So he just has this really gothic style.
Okay.
And Charles himself thought of the manor as, quote, more like a mausoleum, a tomb requiring care, cleaning, and endless costly repairs. End quote. So I mentioned some of the strange art and things that they had in the home, but they also had lots of books on Satanism, and that is because
I'm assuming they were practicing
they were. So at least Charles was, but it's also kind of up for debate. He has said at some point that he's pretty much an atheist, but he just says he's a Satanist. But then there's also proof of him like being a member of the Church of Satan. Regardless, it doesn't really matter. But just to put it all on the table, like that's what he was saying he was, and he had all of this like memorabilia in his home.
Okay.
To be fair, and we'll talk about it in a minute, they didn't let people into their house. So it's not like the people that they were friends with knew how much stuff they had in their house. The only reason that they really knew that they were Satanists is because Charles's Jeep had pentagrams on the side. So that was pretty conspicuous.
Okay.
Regardless, they truly were off the grid. They had no running water. They had no electricity. They went to the grocery store like once every 18 days on the dot. And it was just the two of them living in the house and their two huge bull mastiffs. One's name was Beelzebub, and the other was Arseniath, after the H.P. Lovecraft character.
Okay.
Yep. Outside of the home, they built a small 3-story chicken house, which the top floor contained a hangout spot. And by hangout spot, I do mean orgy den, of course.
With the chickens? The poor chickens.
The chickens are on the bottom floor. The second floor is storage for their like chicken stuff and their porn collection. And then upstairs was just mattresses, and it was called the pink room, and it was completely pink, and the sheets were pink, and everything was pink, and it had all of their sex supplies, and it was where they would take people because they didn't bring people in the house. Everybody just went upstairs to the pink room, and you had to climb a ladder to get there, up 3 stories. It's a little odd.
The poor chickens.
Yeah, I guess that's true. The other
chickens
weird
are
thing,
innocent.
The other weird thing is that there's no pictures of the inside of the pink room anywhere. You can't find them anywhere. And when the author said this in the book, I was like, no shot. There's definitely a picture. It's a crime scene. There's definitely a picture. There's no pictures. There's like a couple pictures of the outside of the chicken house. There's no pictures inside. None. Anywhere. Considering it's like the centerpiece and one of the weirdest parts, there's no pictures of it. Bizarre. I'm Gen Z. We take pictures of everything.
Yeah, but this was way before your time.
I know, but just what I'm saying. Like, it's just weird to me that nobody thought, like, yeah, let's take pictures of the sex room.
Well, I'm surprised. Wait, does the crime actually take place there?
Talk about it later.
Okay.
You're getting ahead of yourself.
Well, you brought it up.
I know, but I'm going to make it your fault. I love this case. So when they finished construction, they decided that a house of this nature required a name. Because, I mean, come on. It needs a name. This place is pretty dope. Like, it's pretty dope. It's, like, less dope than you think it is. It's more primitive than you think it is. But at the same time, whatever you're thinking, elevate that. It's so weird.
I was going to say, I don't know that I could call place without, like, plumbing dope.
Right, but that's what they wanted. So I think for what they wanted, it was pretty cool.
Yeah.
And considering that they built it by themselves, and pretty much Charles built it because Joey was in a pretty bad car accident several years prior, many years before. And he had some brain damage and like some serious mobility issues because he had broken his leg in the accident. And he was laid up for a long time. And Charles nursed him back to health. He was his doctor. He was his buddy by. And so he couldn't really work that much. So Charles pretty much built the whole thing like by himself, by hand, in a year. And they had an RV for a while. They were living in their Jeep and in tents in northern Georgia. It was, yeah, kind of insane.
I am shooketh.
Yeah. And it was more than one story, too. It was 2 stories and like
How big is it?
Smaller than you think, but big enough that where, like, when they call it a manor, I was like, yeah, okay.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I think it only really had 2 bedrooms, but the ground floor was pretty decent. Like, he had an office, like a large office, and they had a kitchen and 2 living spaces and like gazebos and the chicken house. The chicken house was a square, though. I was kind of bummed that they like left out, like they didn't make it a circle too.
The chickens would get confused. They would just run in circles.
Oh, I didn't think about the chickens.
I don't know. I don't know.
So there are 2 reasons that they could have named it this way, but I think that the second one makes more sense. The first one is that the day that they closed on the property, actually technically the day after, because the first time they tried to drive out to the property, they got really lost and they had to sleep in their car and then they found it the next day. But the second day when they found the road, there was a rotting horse corpse on the road. And some people were like, that's probably not a good sign. Like, maybe this is like a bad omen. But nope, Charles thought it was cool and they moved the horse off and they buried it. And they decided to christen that road Dead Horse Road is the name of their road leading up to their house. And then the other story, and some people say that that also led to Corpsewood Manor, but the main story, and the story that I believe, is that the trees surrounding the property were bare at the time that they finished construction, and they looked really kind of creepy, and so they named it Corpsewood Manor. The trees looked like corpses.
Gotcha.
The only problem with Corpsewood was that they had just moved to Georgia from Chicago, and the area that we opened our story in wasn't exactly super happy about having gay, orgy-loving Satanists in their area.
Yeah, I kind of wondered about that when you said he wanted to live openly. I was like,
right.
I mean, even back then, I would imagine you could live more openly in Chicago than you could in Georgia.
He worked for the government in Chicago. Like, he worked for the U.S. government. So I think that was part of the reason he was still pretty quiet about it. But I will say that the public perception of them in Trion was not as bad as you think it would be. Because pretty much the pair just kept to themselves. The people at the grocery store learned to expect them every 18 days or once a month, depending on the time of year.
Yeah.
And they were known for hosting these really strange parties with their friends. And the only other issue is that they would let teenagers come to their property to drink. So if they couldn't drink at home, they would come out to Corpsewood Manor and drink, and Charles would let them be there, and he would give them some of his homemade wine, which was apparently like knock you on your ass potent. So that, of course, wasn't great with the parents of the area, but there were others who weren't bothered because he would simply share his homemade wine with anyone that asks. And they were kind when people came to the property. As long as they knew exactly what they were walking into, they were welcoming. They would let anybody come hang out, and they had friends in the area. Like, they made friends.
Okay.
Especially with the nudist. They really liked the nudist. His name was Zeke.
Zeke?
They're buddies.
I mean, who wouldn't get along with the nudist named Zeke?
Yeah. Charles had befriended the motorcycle gang in the area, and they felt like a certain air of protection over them. You know, they had people.
Yeah. Well, whether they had people or they didn't, like, who are they bothering?
Right. They weren't bothering anybody.
They would keep to themselves.
Right. And like I said, they had visitors often, but they never invited them to the main house. They all stayed secluded to the pink room. There were many local people who came to know the pair over the 6 years that they lived there, and 2 of those people were Kenneth Brock and Tony West. Kenneth Brock was 17 in the year 1982. He was raised by an abusive father and kicked out of the house at a young age. And when he met Tony, Tony took him in, and Tony was, I believe, in his early 30s when he met him at the time. Brock met Charles and Joey because he had decided he wanted to go hunting on their property, and so he asked them first if they would be cool with that. And Charles and Joey had this question before. They had 40 acres, and people had asked before, can I hunt there? And they were like, yeah, sure, as long as you don't come like within a certain perimeter of the house. Like, we don't care. I mean, and he just meant like, don't hunt so close to the house because like we have dogs.
Well,
like,
yeah,
they didn't care if they hunted, you know, in general.
I knew what you meant.
Right. And so finally, Brock started coming up closer to the house, and he wasn't shocked when he showed up, and they actually were gay Satanists who had sex parties. Like, he kind of was like, you know, this is just a rumor. Nope, showed up. Truth. Now, there are rumors that Charles engaged in sexual activities with Kenneth Brock, And there are some people that say these are non-consensual. I don't know what to think because we only have Brock's side of the story on that. And it's not a super reliable side of the story. Not saying that it didn't happen, but I'm saying there is no other evidence that Charles ever had any other non-consensual relations.
Gotcha.
Now, Tony, his roommate and newfound mentor, had a less than stellar rap sheet. Starting at a young age, his concerning behavior began when he was a teenager and he shot and killed his 3-year-old nephew while attempting to show him that guns aren't something to be feared. He says now that this was accidental and he didn't know that the gun was loaded, but regardless, don't point and shoot a gun at a 3-year-old.
Yeah.
Concerning behavior even if you think it's not loaded. Around 30, he escaped jail where he was serving time for theft, and when he was out, he shot his brother-in-law. I don't think he killed him, but he definitely shot him. And I don't know the story on that, but what I do know is that is another record of a violent gun crime. Now, he had escaped prison, so he was stuck between a rock and a hard place. He had a violent record, no money, and that's when he met Brock, who he decided to take in as a roommate to save some on room and board. And when his new roommate told him all about Corpsewood, he was so down to go try some of their wine, see if they would share their drugs. When they met at Corpsewood, Tony was really uncomfortable with the fact that the men were gay. He claims that Charles had sexual relations with one of the guys that they were there with and tried to bring Tony in, and he said no. He said some other ignorant and rude stuff that I won't repeat, and he left. Then he and Kenneth Brock started thinking. They started thinking that Charles and Joey had to be rich. After all, they lived in a castle in the woods. Like, obviously, they had treasure hidden in their house. And these people really needed cash. So they began to devise a plan to rob them, and things began escalating in the planning process. Soon, Tony was planning on sodomizing Charles and all of this other stuff, but that doesn't come to fruition, so I'm not going to go super in-depth to that plan because it's just horrific and I don't want to repeat it. Instead, they go back to Corpsewood to try and get the lay of the land because, like I mentioned, they'd never actually been inside the house, just the chicken house. Well, when they were there, Charles and Joey Odom just refused to let them inside. That's their home, that's their safe space, people don't come in there.
Right.
That didn't deter them because in December of 1982, Kenneth asked to borrow his mother's hunting rifle because he claimed he wanted to go rabbit hunting. This wasn't super unusual, so she let him, and the two began putting their plan into motion. Later that day, they picked up Kenneth's cousin, Joey, who we're going to call Wells. We're going to call him by his last name because obviously Joey Odom.
Yeah.
Wells was 19 and he had recently met a girl named Teresa who he had convinced to go out on a first date with him. And Tony and Brock convinced Wells and Teresa that they should come hang out with them that day instead of going on their date as planned. And this is his uncle, so he was like, yeah, okay, sure. So they go get gas, and when they get gas, they tell them, we're going to go up to Corpsewood. They're like, don't know how we feel about it, but they convince them otherwise. They weren't really thinking it through because the entire time they were huffing something called Toodaloo, which is alcohol, paint thinner, and glue out of a bucket.
Ugh.
Living the dream. It gives them a similar feeling to like crack, and it's cheaper than crack.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Still.
For sure, for sure. So Wells and Teresa did not know what the plan was. They were just along for the Toodaloo. And when they arrived, Charles, as always, welcomed them in, bummed a cigarette for Joey in the kitchen, and then he took them all up to the pink room where they drank wine and they huffed. And finally, Brock went out to his car under the guise of getting more Toodaloo and came back with the rifle. Which is awkward because you just come back with a gun. And Charles, always eager to just ease any awkwardness, jokingly just went bang, bang, like joking around because his friends in Chicago would always say like he was really good at diffusing. He was a very charming guy.
Right.
So he was good to have in awkward situations, and this behavior just continued that trend for him. And it did diffuse the behavior for about 20 minutes. But unfortunately, when Charles got up to turn the heat lamp on, or up, Brock grabbed him by the hair and held a knife to his throat. Still trying to defuse, Charles says, whatever game you want to play, I'll play your game. But in response, Brock and Tony restrained Charles with strips of the sheet from one of the mattresses. They demanded to know where the money was, and Charles stated honestly that they didn't have any. The money that they did have was in a bank, but they didn't keep anything here. And that's true. When they would go to the grocery store, they would write checks.
Yeah, I don't understand why anybody would assume.
Yeah.
Even if they have money, why would you assume that they keep stuff hidden?
Elysia, they're huffing Toodaloo. I don't know.
It's true.
They're not thinking is the real thing. They don't know.
Oh, boy. Okay.
So when he continued to swear up and down that he didn't have any money, they continued to restrain him from more fabric from the pink room. And Teresa was very upset. And despite his situation, Charles asked her if she was okay. She was like, "You better worry about yourself, bud." And Wells and Teresa found an opportunity and bolted down the ladder the first chance they could. West followed them down with a gun, saying he didn't want to hurt them, but he would if he had to. Wells, pleading, convinces him to let them go to the car. Unfortunately, the car won't start. So then they're stuck, being escorted at gunpoint back upstairs to the pink room, which is just horrifying to think that they almost got away.
What was the point in having them?
So the point in picking them up was to make them look less suspicious, but in the end, they just had extra witnesses. It wasn't thought through.
It's the Toodaloo.
It's the Toodaloo. So Tony and Brock took the sign that the car wasn't starting as the fact that they were doing the right thing. They were like, this means we're doing the right thing. They continued to demand the location of the money, and when Charles consistently says there isn't any, Kenneth Brock decided he was going to hunt down Joey Odom. He fires a barrage of bullets into the kitchen after finding where he was, and he kills Joey, and unfortunately he also kills the 2 dogs. And this must have happened really fast because the dogs never moved from where they were. They liked to sleep by the stove, like the wood-burning stove, because it was warm.
Yeah.
And that's where they were. So they never even got up. When forced to face the scene, Charles was distraught, and many people think that this is when he gave up. At one point, he looked at them and said, "I asked for this." Shortly after, they shot him in the head 4 times. Tony went a little overkill and shot him 4 times in the head. Then
What the hell?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Then, satisfied that the both of them were dead, they continued and they started looting the house, and they were genuinely disappointed to find that Charles was telling the truth. There was no cash in the home. They stole some silver, a pistol, some expensive trinkets, and essentially only money that they left with was nickels and dimes. They stole the Jeep and a gun. During this time, they forced Wells to help loot, and when Tony was alone with Teresa, he tried to proposition her for sex. This is the scariest night of her life.
Yeah.
And he's trying to get her to have sex with him. Eventually, Charles and Joey both required an additional shot to fully kill them.
What?
They hadn't shot them well. They were still...
4 times in the head wasn't enough?
Nope. And he was just making sounds. Charles was just making sounds. But before they heard Charles, they went back into the kitchen area, and they say that Joey had actually moved. Like, he had moved his body. He'd crawled or dragged himself from part of the kitchen into, like, the hallway area. So they shot him again in the head with the pistol that was actually Charles's pistol. And then later they heard Charles making sounds, and they killed Charles, and they shot him with a 5th time. Eerily, prior to his passing, Joey Odom had had a dream that Charles should paint a self-portrait. The self-portrait ended up being of Charles's bust, his head area, gagged with 5 bullet wounds to his head. And he told Joey that this is how he would die, that he had this vision, and it was hanging above where his body was.
No.
I have the picture. I'll show it to you. You want to see it?
Oh my God.
Mm-hmm.
That's horrifying.
So the self-portrait watched them as this prophecy came to fruition, and it watched as the crew loaded the loot that they had into their Jeep, and it watched as they drove away, leaving Joey and Charles in their home. Brock and Tony dropped Wells and Teresa off and swore that they would get revenge if they called the police. They told them they were taking off for the Philippines and they would send for them later. Once they left, Teresa told Wells, like, she wanted to call the police, like, immediately. And he said, no, don't do that. And eventually, she tells the same story to his mother, Myra. And Myra's like, no, don't call the cops. Because remember, Kenneth Brock is Joey Wells's uncle. Myra, his mother, is his sister. So she's related.
Is Kenneth's sister.
Yes, it's Kenneth's sister.
Gotcha.
So she's like, don't call the cops on my brother. Like, don't do that. And she was like, I think I'm going to. And so finally she was like, don't do that. She drops her off at her dad's house. Teresa tells her dad that she had witnessed a murder, but then Myra comes back and gets her and basically kidnaps her and holds her hostage for 4 days because she doesn't trust that she's not going to go to the cops.
What the hell?
She eventually gets to a phone and she calls her uncle and her friends and they come and get her. But in the meantime, the boys head down to Alabama, not Wells, he stays there, but Brock and Tony head down to Alabama.
Okay.
And they're talking about going to Florida or even Mexico when they decide that they should dump their conspicuous stolen Jeep with pentagrams on the side.
You think?
Yes. They decided that they wanted to steal a Toyota, and when they pulled off to rest, they realized they were parked next to Toyota. It was another sign. So the two held up Lieutenant Kirby Key Phelps at gunpoint, and when he realized what was happening, he allowed them to cuff him. He was like, okay, you want my car? You take whatever you want. That's fine. He allowed them to handcuff him, but later when they took him to a nearby tree and they uncuffed one hand to try and cuff him to the tree, he swung and he punched Tony right in the face. But unfortunately, this resulted in Tony shooting and killing the undercover officer.
You're in big trouble now.
Oh boy.
Big trouble.
They took his ID, they swapped plates, and then the two split. One took the Jeep and then abandoned the Jeep, and then they met up together and they took off in the Toyota. Now, the officer's body was discovered on December 15th by a Civil War relic hunter. Somebody out in the woods looking for Civil War relics. This story isn't real. I'm telling you, it's made up. It's so crazy. But he didn't have any ID, so it was a while before they figured out who it was.
Mm-hmm.
So back to Corpsewood Manor. The house is sitting there abandoned, and a friend of theirs comes to let them know that unfortunately another one of their mutual friends had passed away. When he approached, he didn't see the Jeep, and he assumed it was grocery day, although he was like, I think I counted that, and it's not grocery day, but they're not here, so that's fine. And he came back the next day and still didn't see the Jeep, and he was like, well, this is concerning.
Right.
So he goes up to the kitchen door, and he realizes that it's open, and he sees bullet holes, and he decides to just turn back around and go immediately to the police. Police come upon the grisly crime scene, and as soon as they search the house, they were like, this is... What are we looking at here? Such a weird scene for some Georgia police officers to walk into.
Yeah.
And while they're searching the scene, the Jeep is actually found in Alabama. I just trying to put myself in the shoes of these detectives. Like, they walk into this house that, like, they knew was back here. They knew these people were here. They had tried to look into prosecuting them because they didn't want them here. They thought they were trouble, but there's nothing they could do. They weren't doing anything illegal, so they had left them alone. Because they were Satanist. That's why. And they were gay. But there was nothing they could do, so they had left him alone. And they had this, like, mutual relationship where they just don't interact.
Yeah.
They had no idea what was actually inside the house. So they walk in, and this house is probably the thing from their nightmares. It must have been so terrifying for them. It's pretty cool looking, honestly. But, like, that's an objective, standpoint.
Yeah.
Walking in to find this horrible crime scene, they didn't know where to start. Like, where do you start looking? Where do you start trying to point the finger here? And at first, they found some letters that Charles was writing back and forth to felons. He tended to write pretty explicit letters to men in prison, and he had some pen pals. And so they assumed that it was somebody who had escaped prison and was coming after them.
Okay.
Yeah. The sheriff's next issue was to figure out how to secure the property because everybody knew what had happened and people wanted to come see. So they blocked off Dead Horse Road, but that didn't stop news helicopters from coming in and getting aerial pictures. And once the investigation was complete of the actual home, they welded the front door shut because it was steel in an attempt to keep people out. But unfortunately, it didn't work. People were crazy. They tore out rose bushes. They broke into the home and ransacked it for souvenirs. They tore the steel doors off of the front, which was just, the whole thing is very disrespectful. The home and the chicken house were eventually victims of arson, and, like, the chicken house is completely gone. The chimney is the only thing that's left. There are relics and like old portions of the brick still in place, but most of the inside of the home was completely destroyed.
It's like a little bit maddening. How
People think we're weird.
Will be like, we don't want you here. You're weird, blah, blah, blah. And then something like that happens and they want souvenirs.
Right.
Why?
Right.
You didn't want them there in the first place.
Right. When the police had taken like the 2 human skulls that he had been using as decoration from the school and like, but like they had this stained glass window that they took. It's just crazy. So the investigation, like I said, was leaning firstly towards prisoners or felons. But on December 16th, when Teresa was finally able to, she called the sheriff's office. Now, he was out in the field working the case, but she convinced the office that it was really important that he call her back.
Yeah.
So he did right away because he was like, well, that's weird. And she convinces him to come talk to her in person. So he leaves the field, he comes out and he talks to her. He was out actively investigating this case and he goes to her and she basically tells him everything. And then he finds Joey Wells and he corroborates the story. And a warrant was placed out for the arrest of Tony West and Kenneth Brock.
Okay, but did they arrest Myra for kidnapping her for 4 days?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question.
Ugh. Okay.
Now, Tony and Kenneth were starting to turn on each other. They made it down to Texas before they started arguing over whether or not they actually needed to go all the way to Mexico. And they were just bickering all the time. They were tired and stressed. And eventually they decided to go to a topless bar to try and cool off a little bit. I don't know. Don't ask me. It's the Toodaloo.
That's not the Toodaloo. They've run out of the Toodaloo.
And so they were running out of money, so I don't know what they were doing at a bar. But the alcohol made the situation worse, and eventually Kenneth ditched and hitchhiked all his way. He hitchhiked all the way back to Marietta, Georgia.
Wow.
Here, I think he just couldn't take the stress anymore, and he calls his mom from a payphone. And she tells him that there's a warrant out for his arrest, and he's like, yeah, because I did it. Yeah, that was me, Mom.
Yeah.
So he then just can't stop talking, and he goes to tell gas station workers in the area. And he tells them about the Navy ID that he took off of Kirby. Now, when he told his mom, ironically, the police pulled up at his mom's house, like right around the time she got off the phone. So she, of course, was like, yeah, he's in Marietta. You got to go get him. And so they had called the police department there, and they had worked out a deal for the police in Marietta to come and arrest him. Right. It's in Georgia still. Yeah. So this led to the ID of Kirby being discovered days after his death. Tony, worried that Brock would be caught and confess. He confessed before he was caught, but yeah. He changed his destination from Mexico to Oklahoma. He made it as far as Missouri, and then he decided to head back to Chattanooga, Tennessee. Lots of back and forth here. He arrived in Chattanooga on Christmas Eve, and he got soaking wet walking in the rain towards a club, which is just ironic to me. And it must have seemed like a sign from God. It's a quote from the book. It just was a good quote. Must have seemed like a sign from God. They keep looking for all these signs.
Yeah,
to
that's
keep
why
going.
I'm rolling my eyes.
When there was a police officer in the parking lot of the lounge. And he assumed that he was there to book him. He was like, just take me away. And the officer's like, for what?
Who are you?
And he was like, just take me away. I'm wanted for murder. And the officer was like, okay, what's your name? And he ran him through the system twice. And for some reason, it hadn't gotten around there. And so he was still not popping up.
Well, yeah, this was in the 80s.
Yeah. So they had like a big system, a national system, but it just wasn't populating yet.
Yeah.
And so he was like, okay, well, you're clearly delusional and you're soaking wet. So you're going to come with me. And he decided to give him across the line back to Georgia because he was like, he said, I'm from Georgia. So he was like,
hey,
let's take you back where you came from, friend.
Let's get you down there.
Yes.
You'll be their problem.
Yes. Because, I mean, he looked and there were no outstanding warrants for his arrest, according to his system. So he's thinking, I'll just help you get across the border and get you pointed back in the right direction. Then he was arrested. There's just a lot of issues with the jurisdiction. So they literally ended up, once he was arrested and taken to Chattanooga. And then they were like, no, this is a Georgia crime. They literally uncuffed him, had him walk across the border, and then he was taken into custody by Georgia.
What the hell?
It was all sorts of weird. But Sheriff Gary, on the wee hours of Christmas morning, had his final murder suspect in custody. is this not out of a Hallmark movie? It is Christmas and the case is solved. I have goosebumps. Do you have goosebumps? I have goosebumps. Can you imagine? It's like dark and snowing a little. I don't know if it was snowing, but in my head it was snowing. Snowing. And he walks across the border and he's taken into custody and the music slows down. And he's like,
now the sheriff can get to the local talent show, the Christmas pageant.
With the orphans. And he can give them all little orphan sheriff stickers.
Oh my.
And he'll be elected again. I can't. I just couldn't get over it. I'm like, what the heck? Story is crazy.
It is.
Okay. So thanks for hanging in. We're going to get into the trial and the prosecution now.
Mm-hmm.
So listen, there was quite a cast of characters at this trial. And I could talk about this forever. I could talk about this case for a really long time. So on Patreon Live, we're going to talk a little bit about the defense attorney. And we're going to talk about the judge.
Nice. Okay.
Because there's so much that these people are straight out of a movie. It's like a cartoon. I can't make it up. But basically, Kenneth was, like I said, 17. He was offered a plea deal for confession, which he took. And he's still incarcerated to this day.
Okay.
So we are really talking about the trial of Tony West. Samuel Tony West, if we're going to be specific. And they were after the death penalty. And the defense team was like, there's no way this is a death penalty case. The prosecution was like, hell yeah, it is.
Why wouldn't it be?
Why wouldn't it be? And the jury was really a struggle to find because there was no way to find people who knew nothing or were unbiased.
Well, yeah, everybody went and broke and took souvenirs.
Right. And like everybody knew somebody knew their husband had been at the property.
Right.
Somebody was friends with the DA. Somebody was friends with the judge. Like one guy knew all of the attorneys on the case. Like This jury was a hot mess.
Yeah.
This was brought to the attention of the judge. The judge chose not to do something about it.
Oh, wow.
Okay. The case went to the jury. The jury went to deliberate, and they deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with guilty on all counts. A member later said they only spent like less than half an hour talking about the case. And of course, this is a death penalty case, so that's not the only thing they do. They then go and work on the sentencing portion. The jury is deciding whether or not this is a death penalty case or whether or not he gets the death penalty.
Yeah.
And around 6 o'clock, the exhausted jury who had been sequestered, so they're ready to go home, came back with a death penalty verdict. So he was to be put to death on May 2nd between the hours of 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., which was less than 2 months away.
That's quick.
Right. And to try
How do you do that? I thought they
tried to do it like to get away from the appeal process.
Yeah. I thought you had to give them time. If somebody gets the death penalty, you have to give them time to appeal.
You're supposed to, yes. He does appeal. And there's some back and forth about which lawyers they're going to use. And there's just like so much drama. But basically, he gets a really good attorney. And recently in Rome, Georgia, there was a death penalty verdict that had been overturned because of an imbalance in the jury pool. So they knew that there's precedence to like overturn this issue. And less than a year after he was sentenced to death, because once the appeal process started, his death penalty was stayed. And then the Supreme Court of the state of Georgia reversed his conviction and ordered that he be reindicted and retried.
Okay.
The issue is that death penalty cases are really expensive, and the people of the area were pissed off because it had cost them almost $80,000 in taxpayer money to host this trial, and the judge knew about it and knew that this was going to be an issue. So they had like a town, like an open meeting. They called it Pots and Pans Day, I think. And the people came in and they were pissed off about this happening. So they ended up having to change venues and to change it to a different area.
Which they should have done in the first place.
Well, exactly. At last, the case was retried and a sentence was, put back out. And this judge was able to accept Tony's guilty plea and sentenced him to consecutive life sentences. So he had tried, basically when I say he was able to accept it, the reason I say it like that is because when they switched judges, Tony's defense attorney was like, thank gosh, because now you're willing to accept a guilty plea, because you weren't willing to do it in front of that judge for a million other reasons. This judge was just a lot to work with. So now for this judge, he was able to get him to accept a plea deal.
Okay.
So, unfortunately, that is not the end of the legal issues surrounding Corpsewood Manor. Now, Tony is still incarcerated. He was not allowed to be paroled. They're both still in jail.
Okay.
The estate was left behind. Now, Charles had left everything to Odom, and while they weren't making much money. They basically had $200, maybe $400 worth of income every month between his pension and insurance and Social Security and stuff.
Wow.
But they were living on, they didn't have very many expenses. They didn't have bills to pay. And they lived off their land as much as they could. And they had about $40,000 in the bank, though. So between that, the property, and all of their personal effects, there was some stuff worth arguing over, because he had an art collection and all this like vintage furniture that some of it hadn't been burned down, and a lot of the personal effects had been removed before the arson.
Okay.
The problem was he had left everything to Joey Odom because he was younger than him, and he didn't think that he would predecease him or be killed at the same time.
Right.
And he had disinherited his 3 children intentionally. So now the court had to decide who died first.
Yes.
Basically, forensics experts go back and forth, and they don't know. So, to explain it to you, if Charles had died first, then everything would go to Joey,
right.
And then Joey had died, and it would be distributed to his siblings, who never knew Charles. Charles's children got an attorney, and they said, well, if Joey died first, then everything would have stayed to my father, and then per the law, it would have been distributed to us.
Right.
They could not, for the life of them, figure out who died first. So, the case settled. Joey Odom's relatives got $5,000, a cat statue, and some pictures of Joey, and a portrait of him and some of his artwork. Charles Scudder's children got the remaining.
I mean, that makes sense.
That's how it was settled. The real estate was sold eventually, and it was transferred to a man in Alabama whose last name is Osborne. That's all we know about where the land stands to this day. In the meantime, Zeke, the nudist, lived at the property, and he lived on the land.
Oh.
Until he died.
Wow.
Yeah.
Zeke.
He had like laid out rubber mats by the lake, or by the pond, so that he could like roll around naked.
What?
He was living it up at his friend's house. He was like, this is what they would have wanted.
Wait, but people like tore up the house and stuff. So where did he actually live?
Beats me, dog. I don't know.
He's just one with the land.
Mm-hmm.
In his birthday suit.
Swanging.
Oh, Lord. Okay.
Now, there are rumors that the belongings that their heirs took from the home were cursed, because they all had a pretty bad string of luck after they took those into the home. And a lot of their stuff they ended up auctioning off. They're like, we can't keep this.
Oh, wow.
Yep. And lots of ghost stories still haunt the property. Now, people still go. You can still see some of the relics there. A lot of it's taken over by like overgrowth, but if you go and you look, you can see where the bricks are for most of the property. And I'll have pictures on social media. Now, one thing I didn't mention, and I can't believe I didn't mention it, but Charles was a harpist. He had this huge golden harp that he played, and he played beautifully. Beers and Queers actually had a recording of part of him playing the harp and reciting poetry. And it was so eerie and beautiful. But unfortunately, that clip, I literally can't find it anywhere. And it's in a documentary that they recommended we not watch. They were like, it was very biased. It was very rude. It was not good.
Gotcha.
But it's the only place I can find this audio recording. And I don't want to support that. And I don't want to like give them my money. So if you want to hear it, Highly recommend going over and listening to Beers with Queers.
Gotcha.
They posted
Okay.
about it. It was so creepy, but so good. In addition to this is my favorite ghost story that came from this. And I went down a rabbit hole on Reddit. I read a bunch of these ghost stories about the manor and like the property and people who go visit and they see things. My favorite actually comes from the author of the book. Her name is Amy. And she wrote, and I'm just going to read this directly from the book. 2 days after turning in my original manuscript, I had a remarkable experience. While getting the kinks borne out of months at a computer working on her book, I mentioned to the masseur that I had just finished a book about the murders of 2 gay men in Trion. He asked if they had occurred years ago, and when I answered 1982, he told me about visiting the burned-out ruins of Corpsewood with friends on a dare. They planned to stay longer, but it was cold. He acknowledged it may have been December, but he was not sure. And when they arrived, there were no other cars there. They found 2 odd men sitting in the lawn chairs in the middle where the house had been. They were nice enough, although dressed a bit shabbily. The 2 men, who appeared in their 40s, told them that they met there at that spot on the same day every year. They chatted for a while about the tragedy that had happened at that spot many years before. The 2 strangers appeared disturbed by a loud vehicle running up and down the road, disturbing the peace and quiet. And the 2 men turned, and when they returned, their friends were gone. I asked what they looked like, and besides remarking on their age and dress, he said that one was built solidly and the other was smaller. I asked if the larger one had dark hair and the smaller one light, and he said yes. I had a printed copy of the manuscript with photos in my car, and when I was done, I fetched it and showed him the photo of Charlie. His jaw dropped, and he said that the blonde man was identical to the photo, right down to the style of his clothing. He had been there in December, and the ghost told them that they were there that same day every year. This masseuse had absolutely no idea until she started talking about it. And that was his own story.
Wow.
Some people say that when they visit the area, they can still hear the harp being played in the distance. Some people say that they see shadows of creatures that could have been the dogs. There are rumors that Charles had invoked a demon to protect their property and that sometimes you can still see it in the distance. This story is fantastic. A horrible crime that was committed really for money, but just happened to be against, 2 of the strangest, coolest, most secure men. They knew exactly what they wanted and they had worked really hard to get there. They got to enjoy their life for 6 years before they were killed. And it's just
wild.
Yeah. So that's my story.
Why has Hallmark not picked this up?
I know. Probably because they're gay.
Probably. Because it's not about a country girl who went to live in the city.
She comes back.
But then comes back.
To save her family's farm.
Yeah.
Their tulip farm. Shout out to Gore Report and to Beers with Queers. You guys did awesome coverage. Shout out to this book. It's awesome. It's hard to find true crime books that you feel like are actually good. And this one I really enjoyed. I think I read it in like an hour. It was really good.
Wow.
It's short, but it was good. And if you want to hear a little bit more about it, we can talk about it this week on live stream.
Yeah. Thank you for covering that. That's wild.
I know. I've been like thinking about it for weeks.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like half speechless because
the weird things about this case to me are like the portrait that has haunted me. I straight up had a dream about it. Not like a scary dream, but just like a dream about it. Like,
and here's the thing. I think a lot of people are skeptical about stuff like that, but unless you've known somebody who did something or said something, knowingly or not, and then they died, I can understand people being skeptical, but I actually have known somebody who was young and who eerily did things and said things right before they died that didn't make sense at the time. And then they died in a fire. And then it all made sense.
Yeah.
And we don't think that she knew she was going to die. We think it was just like an intuition thing of like, I need to take care of these things before.
It's just bizarre.
Yeah.
And like, to talk a little bit more about Charles's relationship with his religion, he was an atheist, but he was very spiritual. And like, generally a misconception about the Church of Satan. They don't actually worship Satan. I went down a rabbit hole, and it's in the book too. They don't actually worship Satan. They're pretty much atheists who just believe in like following your body and your intuition. And they're called the Church of Satan as like a spite thing.
Yeah.
But they do believe in like spirituality and in what they call magic and like things like that, where, you know, and it's just such a bizarre case where you just look at it and there's all these things. It's just, there's so many questions. Well,
Anyway.
thanks for keeping it here. If you made it all the way here, go ahead and leave us a little dog emoji for Beelzebub and Arsnath.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Poor dogs.
Yeah, but I will say one thing that made me feel a little bit better is I really don't think that they knew what was happening, and it happened really fast.
Yeah.
So that's, you know, the only positive thing.
Yeah.
It's not a positive thing at all. I don't know. What do you say?
Yeah.
Yeah. Leave a dog
What do you
emoji
say?
or like a fun little like bat emoji. I don't know. These guys were kind of weird.
What'd they do with all that LSD? Well, they gave it to friends
the
for their
LSD.
parties.
Okay, no. The LSD thing. I didn't talk about it because we're running long here, but the LSD, when they took everything out of the house, one of the vials was missing some LSD. Something around like 1,400 doses, I think, were missing. Now, Charles did not like to do drugs. There are some people that account that he was still conducting his experiments with people who were willing to take the LSD. There are some that say he was selling it, but all of that to be said, it was a point of contention in the trial. I honestly didn't report it because to me it didn't make sense why they were even talking about it. It had nothing to do with whether or not Tony was guilty. I don't know why it was involved at all. It was involved because they hadn't mentioned it as evidence, but that's it. That was really the issue. Anyway, after the trial concluded, we don't know where the evidence went, but there are reports of very clean LSD on the street being sold. So somebody in the police department allegedly took it out of the evidence locker and gave it and sold it to a dealer who then redistributed it.
Right.
And it was really clean drugs. That's how they knew it wasn't just off the street. That's how they kind of put two and two together because, like I said, he was experimenting with government-created LSD. It wasn't laced with anything, and it wasn't, you know.
Yeah.
So that's where the LSD ended up. Now, Charles did not take it regularly, and sometimes he would share with friends, but it wasn't like their go-to. He regularly made wine. That's what they did.
All right.
They would also have these really elaborate sex parties that I know way too much about, but I just can't repeat. So I just need you to know that I know this because it is weird.
I believe you.
Yep.
We'll leave it at that.
It's Thomas Jefferson levels of weird sex parties. So we're going to leave it at that.
Oh, okay. Not sure
Aren't you so glad you listened to this part of the episode?
All right.
I'm going to go feed Elysia. She's hungry.
Yes.
It's time for lunch, and we hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Till next time. Bye.
Thanks for listening, guys. Find us on Instagram and TikTok at Burden of Proof Pod and email us at burdenofproofpod@gmail.com.